morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
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 And we got too many empty seats in the front. This is not church. We need to come closer. I'm Aaron Williams, Executive Vice President for Government Relations and Communications here at RTI. And I'd like to welcome you to this unique event, new initiative to provide insight into global youth unemployment issues, Youth Voices, part of Generation TBD. We're very pleased and excited to be working closely with the GroundTruth Project and GlobalPost in this endeavor, as well as the members of the Global Center for Youth Employment. Thank you both the attendees here in the room in our offices in DC, and those of you who are joining us from around the world via video stream. We're pleased to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to a fascinating discussion. RTI International is an independent nonprofit institute that provides a wide range of research, development, and technical services to government and corporate clients around the world. We have a very simple mission, and that's to improve the human condition. Simple but challenging, as we all know. We look at the challenges facing the world today. And you know, the other reason why I'm really glad to be here today with you is because I am very optimistic about the future generation. I was just talking to Charles Sennott a minute ago about this, that so often the coverage that we find about young people around the world, it seems to me, in my personal opinion, tends to be negative. We don't see the wonderful things that young people are doing every day around the world. And I had a very privileged perch and position to see that when I was director of the Peace Corps in the first term of the Obama administration. So I traveled to some 20 countries and I saw young Americans working with their young counterparts and partners in HIV/AIDS clinics, working on irrigation projects in arid deserts, speaking the language, understanding the culture, and making a difference in the world, transforming both their lives and the lives of the people they were with, embraced by their communities. And so I came away from that experience very optimistic about the future of the world and the role that young people are going to play in leading this world when we, the baby boomer generation, pass that baton. So I'm really happy to be here today because of that. So a year ago, RTI spearheaded the formation of a new Global Center for Youth Employment to address the challenge of youth and workforce development. And from the beginning, we set out to do something that was unconventional in terms of our approach. We built the center on two pillars. The first is collective impact. We all believe that by working together, of course, we can have a greater impact. The second pillar is innovation. We cannot keep doing the same things over and over again and expect different results. And as we all know, this is a field that is ripe for innovation. So last April, we held a two-day Ideathon that brought together 40 thought leaders who pitched 22 innovative ideas to improve the global youth unemployment crisis. We used a process that was part of a Shark Tank and some democratic voting, just like up in New Hampshire today, right? To reduce the list down to the top 5 ideas. And we now have teams from 30 different organizations working on the further development of these ideas. Now, one of those original ideas is the reason we're here today. Youth Voices, a digital platform of searchable multimedia data consisting of videos and articles from youth around the world that captures their concerns, issues, and hopes and ambitions relative to their future employment and their future overall. Today's world, of course, is a very challenging place. You know, just pick up any newspaper, look anywhere online, turn on the television. We know there's lots of challenges. The issues facing today's young people are enormous, probably maybe more severe than they've been in recent history. Half the world's population is under 25, and more than 620 million young people are not in education, not employed, or not in training. Everywhere you travel today, whether it's in Rio or Bangkok, Jakarta, San Salvador, you see the same thing. Large masses of young people who are not engaged in anything that's going to lead to a productive future. We have to do something to address this issue. Certainly, unemployment among young people is at what some might call epidemic levels. As global forces restructure our economies and transform labor markets, the world's youth are being disproportionately impacted. This is a problem that reaches not just the developing world, but also our country here in the United States. But we got to be careful about generalizations about any large group. For example, what we know as the life and the challenges facing young Chinese is not the same for young Americans or young Brazilians or young Kenyans. It has to be looked at in a cultural context. Therefore, it's vital that we understand the youth perspective on what is work and what is their view of work is, and also what are the obstacles and the opportunities. Youth Voices represents an innovative way to capture the thoughts and perspectives of the world's youth. It puts youth at the center of the conversation about their own economic challenges and successes, thereby re-engineering, in our view, the international community's response to the job crisis. Amplifying the voices of youth has the power to inform policymakers, compel public action, and ultimately connect more young people to jobs in the countries where they live. We think the collective efforts of the Global Center for Youth Employment and our media partners can accomplish the big goal, the next generation of communication. So that's why we are here today. And now let me introduce our moderator, the distinguished Charles Sennott. And thank you, Charlie, for being with us today. He's a fearless journalist and a thought leader in the world of communication. He's a co-founder of GlobalPost. He also heads up the GroundTruth Project, a foundation-supported initiative that is dedicated to training the next generation of foreign correspondents in the digital age. Charlie is an award-winning foreign correspondent with 25 years of experience. He has reported on the front lines of wars and insurgencies in at least 15 countries, including for PBS Frontline in the 2011 revolution in Cairo and the Arab Spring. He was among the first journalists on the ground in Afghanistan following 9/11. He has continued reporting there throughout the last decade. He is the author of 2 books, The Body and the Blood and Broken Covenant, and a co-author of a 3rd book. In 2005, Charlie was awarded a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University. His reporting has won numerous journalism awards, including the prestigious Livingston Award for National Reporting and the Foreign Press Association Story of the Year. And he was named a finalist for the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting by Harvard University's Shorenstein Center. For the last 2 years, Charlie has served as a juror in the International Reporting category for the Pulitzer Prize. He also sits on the board of the Overseas Press Club Foundation. I don't really know how we convinced him to join us today. This is a very busy man. Charlie has been a frequent analyst of the Middle East and religious extremism for the BBC, CNN, and the PBS NewsHour and NPR. He is a sought-after public speaker who has given talks at the Council on Foreign Relations, the Salzburg Global Seminar, and the Newseum. He has also delivered formal lectures at the leading universities in the country, including Harvard, Columbia, Dartmouth, the University of Southern California, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, Beijing University. Now that's not in the United States, Charlie. Somehow you deviated from your course. And Providence College, where he delivered the commencement address and was awarded an honorary doctorate for his reporting on religion amid conflict. We're very proud to have such a distinguished and obviously a fearless journalist, someone who cares about the truth, who is trying to do something to change the future generations as we move forward in this digital age. And we're proud that we're partners with GroundTruth. And so first of all, before Charlie makes his remarks, we're going to have a video that we'd like for you to see to start our proceedings off. Thank you very much, and welcome again to RTI International.
We live in a world of 24/7 reporting of people who comment from cubicles, people who give their opinion from a university or from a think tank. What we don't have and what we need is to get those journalists out on the ground. That's not getting funded, that's not happening, and we need to restore that, and GroundTruth's going to be part of that. The opportunities I had as a young reporter really don't exist right now. We are out there giving young journalists an opportunity to do the work that matters and to do it in the field.
I've been traveling the Ring Road for the last 5 years, covering the U.S. military during their longest war in American history.
What GroundTruth wants to be about really working with these millennial journalists, younger, emerging journalists, so that we hear the big stories of our time from the perspective of the next generation.
The kind of journalism and documentary filmmaking that we're supporting allows for multiple voices from across the globe. The best kind of storytelling helps us to understand the world, helps us to understand our place in the world, and helps us to understand ourselves. It does break down barriers.
Everybody that's worried about this stuff should come to the streets unite and protest against the World Cup. Public money going into stadiums when they should be going to hospitals.
Eu sinto na pele uma frustração e uma falta de horizonte.
We want great writing, we want great photography, we want great videography. We do not expect one journalist to accomplish all three of those. We like to build teams of young reporters who are good at their craft, who each have a talent, and who come together as a team to do multimedia packages.
I was the first Qatari woman in history to step foot on the Antarctic continent. If the ice caps melt, then a lot of places, like my own country, will be underwater. So this is my second expedition, and I brought a team with me to make a documentary. My documentary is about me and a few other characters on this expedition interacting with the Antarctic environment and seeing how that changes a person and how they take that change and implement it back home in their communities.
When I'm with young journalists in a place like Cairo, where we bring 10 super talented young Egyptian journalists together with 10 unbelievably talented American journalists, and you watch them work together as colleagues, as equals, and you watch the local knowledge of the Egyptians combined with the great spirit of inquiry of the American journalists, and you see the potential for what they can do, what their generation can do for storytelling, you know it's the future. We take that in-depth reporting and we then distribute it through our editorial partners. And all of our editorial partners here are people who care about the kind of storytelling we want to do.
The GroundTruth family is a global family. We are looking at some of the most pressing issues facing the world today. Together, we can get closer to understanding what the problem is and understanding what the solutions are.
It's March, the beginning of the school year in Afghanistan. And in a village where all the women wear burqas, Razia stands out.
It's not easy. The culture is very different. So it's like breaking an ice and making a pathway between it. And slowly, slowly, we're chipping away that ice.
Work that we've done has helped to build the first free private college for girls in rural Afghanistan.
We recognize this is a time of rising peril. Journalists have never faced a more dangerous time to be out there in the world telling stories. We know this very sadly firsthand. We've lost colleagues, we've lost friends. What we want to do is build a culture of safety, and we want to be part of a wider global effort that's taking that on. We have come up with what we think is the first training module for the risks that journalists face when they're covering conflict zones, climate change, natural disasters, and covering infectious disease.
These are like a must to carry, then you really need a tourniquet. Think about danger, safety first. Look at you.
Yeah.
You're covered in it. Ebola everywhere.
You've got to figure out a way to create a shield and make sure that a kid who could be infected doesn't touch you, even though that's about the rudest thing you could possibly imagine doing. This training shows that the GroundTruth Project is seriously committed to security for its reporters.
We need to have new models for journalism. We need to have new ways of inspiring young journalists to go out and tell the stories that matter. New ways to support them doing that, where they can make a living, where they can actually get these opportunities, get paid, and do it in a way that's safe. That equation is challenging. GroundTruth wants to be about figuring out the future of journalism. Thanks. In person, I'll actually speak directly, like it won't be off sync. So I wouldn't know how to pull that off. I was thinking how I could fake it, but then it's not going to work. No, thank you for having me this morning. Thank you, Erin, for a really kind introduction. Appreciate it. And I am so honored to be here. We have really gotten to know in the last few days the RTI team more closely. Kevin, of course, has been working with them very closely, but we've really just gained a deeper understanding for what an amazing place it is. And we're deeply honored to be part of this initiative for storytelling, to find the stories of young people and bring those stories forward, to build off of the tremendous expertise that RTI brings in terms of its research and the many programs it does around the world. To think that we could sort of attach our storytelling machine to the tremendous work they do in the field is really exciting. I think it's innovative. I think it's the kind of thing we need to do in journalism, and we're really excited to do it. We're a little behind schedule, so I'm going to try to make my remarks a little bit abbreviated. I want to just tell you very quickly a little bit about my story in journalism, and then I'll introduce our panel and we'll get rolling. I feel like the thank yous, I could just go on, but I do really want to say, Peter, Eric, Andrew, the whole RTI team, thank you for having us, and truly look forward to working together with you. Thanks a lot. We want to talk about storytelling, and I'm going to tell you my story quickly. I am of that last old school kind of journalism where I got a job covering cops and courts and small newspapers, and then I rose up and I worked at a paper called the Bergen Record in New Jersey, and I kind of looked across the river at Manhattan and thought I'm going to get there someday, and I did. I got to the New York Daily News. I got to cover really big stories there. I covered John Gotti. I covered, sort of this exciting film noir experience of working at the New York Daily News in like the last great tabloid newspaper war. And it was really fun. It was really exciting. And I always dreamed of being a foreign correspondent. But for me, the stories were local. I covered Medellin, Colombia because crack cocaine was ravaging New York City. I was in Lower Manhattan one day and heard a loud bang, and it was the first bombing of the World Trade Center. 1993. No one thought it was even terrorism. Local cop reporting led me to go to the sound of the sirens, and some of you are too young to know this story, but there was this attempted they tried to take the towers down and failed in 1993. Terrible bombing, 6 people were killed, 1,000 injured. But it set me on a journey to go and cover the Middle East. I did it just like a police reporter would. Knock on doors. Why would these taxi drivers want to take down the World Trade Center? My editor, city editor, great guy, said, go find out. That's ground truth. That's what it's all about. It's about just following the story, staying with it. It took me to Egypt. It took me to Pakistan. It took me to the Sudan. It took me on a journey that I'm still on, trying to figure that out. When 9/11 happened, I had made a journey, from the Daily News to the Boston Globe. And right after that first World Trade Center bombing, I went to the Globe with the promise you'd become the Middle East bureau chief, and that happened. And I went over there, and I was still reporting on this story, and reported on it for many years, from 1996 when I landed in the Middle East up to 2001, and then of course 9/11 happened. And I did reporting there, opened up the Kabul bureau, and then the Baghdad bureau. And this journey has just continued, but for me, it is all about being there. That's the core of ground truth. I think it's the core of great storytelling. And that's really my story about what we've done. So the challenge now is a business challenge in front of journalism. It's a really big business challenge. So Boston Globe, I had these glorious years working for the man. It would never end, right? The first time I ever, in my whole life, including growing up, had the smell of a new car. It was when the Globe leased one for me in Jerusalem. They took care of you back then when you were a foreign correspondent. But then the challenges began to really set in for newspapers, great newspapers like the Boston Globe that were very proud to have foreign staffs. They couldn't sustain it. So I stepped back. I took a Neiman year at Harvard, thought about all this experience that I'd gone through, and I thought, I want to try something new. And I started GlobalPost. GlobalPost is an online international news organization. We had 70 correspondents in 50 countries at one time. We were very proud of what we started. It was innovative. It was digital. We were doing really exciting things. But we found we had a great editorial team, but we had a flawed business model. It didn't work. It did not succeed. So then I started the GroundTruth Project. Went from a for-profit model at GlobalPost to a non-profit model at the GroundTruth Project. And we get support from leading foundations, from the Ford Foundation, from Luce, from Kaiser, from others. And we are always looking for innovative partnerships, new ways to try to do our work in the field. How can we partner? I think RTI is the most exciting partnership we have. Kevin Grant is our managing editor, who you're going to hear from later today. Really conceptualized this many months ago, sort of was inspired to think about how we might partner. And watching how he and Peter have put this together with the team, with Eric and others, it's just been extraordinary to see it take shape. So I want to thank Kevin for doing that. Once we figured out Ground Truth as the nonprofit model, we based at WGBH, and there we can do big partnerships. Some of the people we've partnered with are, for example, Frontline. We did a documentary on Tahrir Square. We did 2 of them, actually, and I worked with Azmat on those in the field. We were colleagues, and she's an amazing colleague who you're going to hear from very shortly. We also partner with NOVA on our global health coverage. We partner with PRI The World on lots of different reporting we're doing, whether that's climate change or sort of our premier look at the economy, which we call Generation TBD. And Kevin is going to tell you a little bit about that when he speaks. But Generation TBD, briefly, is looking at how millennials are facing an uncertain global economy. What are the challenges? And that's what today is about. Today is really about looking at youth unemployment, tremendous economic challenges for young people, and also, more precisely, how do we as journalists tell that story? So I'm going to invite our panelists to come up, and we will start in on a conversation about precisely that. How do we tell the story? Come on up, you guys. You can sit here, and I'll sit here, I think. That's, I believe. Stage crew come up very quickly. Okay. So the purpose of today was to bring together some really talented storytellers and have them share with us their techniques, their strategies for bringing these stories forward. You know, as Aaron shared with us, the numbers are staggering on the number of unemployed, the kind of reality you see when you travel to any corner of the world is extraordinary, to look at the despair. But I can't help but also see the opportunity. And that's why we called it Generation TBD, Generation to be determined. Tremendous time of opportunity, tremendous time of challenges. One of the great challenges we face is really telling that story. It's so big. The question is sort of how do you get your head around that? How do you get your head around the narratives that we want to bring forward? How can we do our job in these changing models, these great challenges to journalism? So I'm going to introduce our panelists as we go along and have them each speak for about 3 to 5 minutes about sort of how they dealt with these challenges, how you've done your own sort of unique style of storytelling. And I wanted to start, if I could, if I can put you on the spot, Wes. I think Wes Lowery, many of you would know, is a Washington Post correspondent. His coverage of Ferguson has been extraordinary. His coverage really for years has enlightened us about so many things. He was really that voice on the ground in Ferguson that brought the story home for me and for a lot of people. In 2014, he was named National Association of Black Journalists Emerging Journalist of the Year. We're really lucky to have him with us today. Wes also just experienced the loss of a dear friend and was really trying hard to get here. It was touch and go, and we're so glad you made it. And really, truly.
A text message about 25 minutes ago. Like, yeah, I'm coming. Don't worry about it.
Thank you really for making it. I know it's been a difficult time. And
thanks. Of course.
Appreciate you having here.
Thank you.
So let's jump in and talk about, sort of share with us your story about some of the reporting you've done, what you're thinking about in terms of storytelling these days. What kind of challenges do you face?
You know, I think that we face, especially, so I work for a newspaper, right? I work for an old media, as old media gets, right? I work for the Washington Post, right? And so, and I came in initially as a political reporter for the Washington Post before becoming more of a national correspondent. And one of the things that, I fortunately, when I was, even before I got to the Post, had experiences on 2 different teams for 2 different papers covering major national news and watching and seeing how that real-time coverage was what the appetite was for. People did want to wake up the next morning and read the definitive piece. They wanted to know what happened, but in real time, the 2 examples were when I worked for the LA Times and the Christopher Dorner manhunt, LAPD officer who went on this kind of murderous rampage, and the city was, in fact, LA was locked down for several days as they searched for this guy. And we were writing, my colleagues were writing remarkable pieces for the paper, but very often that tidbit from the 7th or 8th graph of the piece, or that great anecdote that was never going to make the piece, there was so much hunger for information on that story that I realized that I was getting so much traction, even from just kind of tweeting out little tidbits. Even though I was maybe the 800th reporter, I mean, I was the least important of the team members, but I was able to propel our coverage or to magnify our coverage by putting that information out. And then I saw the same thing a year later when I arrived at the Boston Globe. I mean, I started the Boston Globe in March of 2014, and exactly 1 month afterwards, terrorists attacked the Boston Marathon bombings. And again, this was another team where I was the least important, I was the last person on the list, right? The least important reporter there, had the least amount of institutional knowledge, the worst sourcing, but could show up and interview people about what was going on. So we were at the hospital, we were at the shootout when they took Tamerlan Tsarnaev and they killed Tamerlan Tsarnaev. And providing that coverage in real time, right? This idea that I knew how to use a phone and use a notebook, I knew how to talk to people and to provide a window into these places. You know, reporters physically on the ground get to places that many of our readers never will get to, right? We will never, most of our readers are never going to hear the gunshots where Tamerlan Tsarnaev's getting killed, and I'm standing there watching it happen. And so it's like, how do we leverage, at the time, social media and the internet, but also now other emerging platforms, to bring the readers and the consumers of news into those spaces so they can experience it and feel it. And so when I landed in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, that was some of it conceptually, right? I knew I was dropping into a community that I knew very little about, and so I said, how can I bring people along with me through this experience of learning about this community, right? And so that's photos and videos and images and direct quotes from people. And again, and a lot of times the inclination of newspaper reporters is to keep everything in your notebook until you sit down to write the piece, right? And what I realized very quickly was that, you know, if I do this knock it out of the park interview with this amazing anecdote for a story, I'm not giving anything away by shooting out a good quote from them, right? In those 140 characters, I'm just doing a vignette, a face, a sign, a scene, and letting someone speak with their own words. And then when we talk about empowering youth voices, or empowering voices that otherwise might not have been represented in the media, it's this idea of how can I leverage my platform to propel their voices, right? And that was, I think, one of the reasons that some of my social media coverage specifically caught on in Ferguson, was this idea that you had these troves of people, thousands of people taking the street, many of whom did not feel empowered, did not feel as if they had voices previously. And I was saying, here, I'll take your picture, I'll send your quote out, and I will use my platform at the Post to let you speak directly to the rest of my readers.
That is very well said. I'm going to come back to you with a question, but before we do, I want to move on to Azmat. My friend, my colleague, Azmat, has been on the investigative reporting team at BuzzFeed. Before that, was also with Frontline, where she was a producer and an extraordinary one. I saw firsthand what it's like to work with Azmat. We landed in Tahrir Square, maybe day 3 or so of the protests, right when it was really starting to crescendo. We had to find our way to tell that story. We worked with young people. We found the stories of the Revolutionary Youth Council in Tahrir, and we really chronicled their hopes and dreams, and Azmat was guiding that along the way. Azmat's accomplishments are extraordinary. You have the profiles here, so rather than go through a long list, I really encourage you to read it. I feel like Azmat's work stands out. She won Online News Association Award for General Excellence in Online Journalism in 2012. She's worked with Al Jazeera. She's worked, as I said, with Frontline. She's had Emmy nominations in New Approaches to Documentary Film in 2014, the Gannett Foundation Award for an Innovative Investigative Journalism. Please read her bio, because it like keeps going and it just gets more awesome. My favorite story that Azmat has done recently is about ghost schools in Afghanistan, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that reporting.
So as the war in Afghanistan, and thanks Charlie, that was very kind. As the war in Afghanistan was drawing down, I was thinking a little bit about the legacy of education in the country. For years I had seen these incredibly impressive statistics that the government had put out, and I'd also seen reporting, mainly from Kabul or embedded with the military. And I wanted to know, this many years later, what are we leaving behind for the next generation? So I'm just going to show you some examples of some of the things that were quite prominent in terms of talking about this as the, oh, I guess it's moving on its own, sorry, as a resounding success in this war that has otherwise been quite tumultuous. And so I decided that I would go to 7 provinces, oops, sorry. All right, I decided I would go to 7 different provinces, that we would visit as many as 50 schools and just sort of go unembedded without, the military, without, local forces, and to go unannounced to schools across the country and see what U.S.-funded schools look like today. And these are just some examples of the schools that I saw. And I specifically went to places that were outside Kabul, battlefield areas that were where like the war for hearts and minds played out. And so these are some of the schools that I saw. They include, empty buildings. You'll see some damage and disrepair, many of which, had roofs that were collapsing. But it's more than about buildings. This is about students, and this is about kids, and what did Afghanistan's next generation get? And what I found repeatedly in many of these areas that are outside Kabul is that there was a level of quality of education that is very different from the way that it's been portrayed. And it's a question of broken promises, and it's a question of, was this inevitable? What were the challenges involved? And so I went out of my way to sort of tell this story, specifically in the case of the narrative of a soldier who tried to build a school. And this is this is not that school. I showed it to you earlier. But, it came down to realizing that every single school has its own particular story. And I was able to trace the money, what happened with each. So this is a school in Kandahar, for example, that in military records is supposedly finished, was transferred to the government, and was operating well by all accounts. But it actually looks like this. And inside it looks like this. And across the street are the children who would have been going to this school. And they study mainly Quran in a mosque across the street. The girls who are at this school actually don't get a modern education. So the Quran is just the extent to which they're learning in this area. And this particular school was surprising to me because it was funded, it was supposedly finished, and I was able to trace what happened, which was, to a very particular contractor. So I spoke with locals who said that, hey, the contractor who carried out this project was the brother of the district governor. I go to that contractor and he says, no, that wasn't us. That was Wali Baradran Construction Company. And I was able to use digital tools in addition to my on-the-ground reporting to confirm things when I couldn't find documents. So in this case, I was able to find Internet Archives that puts those two companies together. There was a USAID school that we couldn't find. We'd gone to go look for. It was supposedly in this village of Nawabad, but the village school in Nawabad was, made out of mud. It wasn't up to the parameters that supposedly it was built to. Turns out, and I used another digital tool here to just check with, at this point I'd left Afghanistan, we hadn't been able to find it. And we went to several other schools and ultimately matched the GPS location to another school in another village that just happens to be home to Kandahar's police chief, Abdul Razik, who is probably the most notorious strongman, the most notorious warlord in southern Afghanistan. So it was a question of, what do these children, what are they getting in each of these instances, and who is that going to if not to them? And ultimately, I found that attendance records were overstated as far back as 2006, that in the schools I was going to, girls were overstated in the numbers by as much as 40%, overall students by 1/3, and that there were more than 1,100 ghost schools in 2011 alone in the country that were receiving teacher salaries that came from a World Bank fund, largely paid for by the United States. And there was just such a trove of the findings like this. And it came down to the fact that it may not be the most positive coverage. It may not be the most uplifting, but it is accountability that we need to have if we want to do this right. So that was my Go School story.
Azmat, it's extraordinary, and I want to come back particularly to the digital reporting, to the use of GPS, for example, such a tool that we can all deploy so much more as journalists. But mostly, I also want to come back to how you did it. You were in some very dangerous areas. How did you navigate that? But we'll come back to that. Hillary? Hillary Frey is the executive editor of Fusion. I presume most of you know that Fusion is a joint venture with ABC News and Univision. They do extraordinary work, and they're particularly focused on telling the stories of young people. I've had a great chance to work with Hillary in different capacities and different ways, both when she worked with NBC News prior to this job, and she's a great colleague. She's a brilliant storyteller, and part of her work that we wanted her to discuss this time now comes to, we can actually work in the words New Hampshire primary and the electoral cycle, and really looking at how you took sort of a traditional form of a debate and made it sparkle and come alive in storytelling. So do you want to share with us that? And I believe you wanted to show us something.
Sure. So part of what I do at Fusion is oversee coverage of 2016. I tried valiantly to get Wesley to come to Fusion to do this with me, but he's very happy where he is. And
we're working on him.
Fortunately, we can always have partnerships and do other things together. But when we set out about a year ago to come up with our plan, my sort of overarching idea was very simple. It was just to be different. And to have that litmus test when your goal is to make 2016 interesting to young, diverse Americans, to make it feel really alive and digital and of the moment and current and relevant. You have to really look at what everybody else is doing and try to do the opposite in many ways. We do not cover candidates. We cover issues. That was the first sort of thing we decided. I don't have a traditional politics team. We pull from across Fusion and all the people who work on our TV side and the digital side to sort of come together and swarm events. So today, Jorge Ramos is in New Hampshire. I think my election production unit set up like 4 different locations for him to go and live stream direct to Facebook. We're not, we're experimenting on different platforms, Snapchat, Facebook, all that stuff. But our big event so far was, it was about a month ago, almost exactly. I was flying to Iowa for the Iowa Brown and Black Forum. This was a Democratic candidates forum that also sort of breaking down boundaries as we're doing at Fusion. It was basically co-produced by me, a very talented veteran TV producer, and Jorge Ramos as executive producer. So we came together across TV, digital, everything else. Not the easiest thing to do, I can tell you. And in about 6 weeks pulled off this massive event that for a fledgling brand and network, we've been around about 2 years, a little more than that, was a huge deal to have. At the time, O'Malley was in the race too. So we had everybody in Iowa. And once we knew we were doing this, we had to ask ourselves, how are we going to make this feel different than what everybody else is doing? So we did this beautiful cold open for the show that I think just shows you right off the bat how different this event was.
Only in the United States is there such a rich mixture of races, creeds, and nationalities.
The boycott is working because millions of people have joined together.
I'm talking about people dying, and that has to stop. What do we want? What do we want?
How weird do things have to get before you register and vote? Turn up the music.
We believe in equality and justice before the law for everyone, not just for some people.
Not now and not on our watch are we going to be pushed away from the decision-making table.
Black, white, brown, red, or whatever will realize that they are somebody.
When brown and black people work together, their impact can be just as great as any other segment of the American society.
you ever wonder whether America is brave enough to live up to our ideals, then look to the generations of ordinary citizens who have proven again and again that we are worthy of that.
No one should be treated unkindly because of the color of their skin or the content of their creed.
Listen to the brave, powerful voices of today's new generation of civil rights leaders.
They're of the present, they're of the future. They understand the beauty of this wonderful country of ours with all the different shades of people we have in this country.
It's our generation's task to follow their example in this journey, to keep building an America where no matter who we are or what we look like or who we love or what we believe, we can be a part of something bigger. And now you have to help us write the next great chapter in America's story.
I love that. Thank you. That was awesome. Thanks. The reveal of the cell phone at the end, it's just the mobile device.
There was a great
there.
hip-hop track that came in the live moment, too. It sounded really powerful.
It is powerful, and thank you to each of you for sharing your storytelling. We're actually way back on track now. This is good. I'm going to circle back to ask you guys some specific questions. I do want to take a moment just to share with you very briefly our sort of journey for trying to find a new way to tell stories of a new generation through youth voices, and that's the specific partnership with RTI. We have a team, as I've said, led by Kevin Grant. It also includes Alex Perlman, who is our digital product manager. She's an amazing person who may not come up on this stage, but she's sitting back there on her phone tweeting away right now, as is Carolina, who is also one of our great colleagues here. They're both working it right now. Youth Voices will be a platform for user-generated content where we hope to bring together 10,000 stories by April. So we wanted to say a few things that would get this thing rocking and set a few goals, and not just have this all be about a nice panel about storytelling. We want to tell you that we want you on Youth Voices. We want you to bang on it. It's totally in beta. It still needs work. But it's a really exciting opportunity for us to think about new forms of storytelling. How can what we're basically doing is we're reversing the model. You know, we do these reporting fellowships. We used to put out the word, and then we would get flooded with like 1,000 applications for like 5 fellowships. And the applications were so great. They were so beautiful. Young people telling us what they wanted to do. You realize the tremendous yearning to do good, meaningful, in-depth journalism. We couldn't answer all this need. And then we would sit there with their beautiful stories and their essays and their cover letters and their resumes laid out on tables that no one else was seeing except us. And we realized, what if we flipped it? What if you have a UGC model where all those stories come in and we start to blanket it out there for everyone to see and really share with us on the journey to select a smaller number of people. We can't fund 10,000. I would love to be able to fund 10,000 journalists and storytellers and talented young people out there, but we can't. We can do 35. So we're going to take 35 young journalists or storytellers. They don't have to be journalists. They could be from any kind of field where they see something important to share, an important story to tell about this generation, and take those 10,000 youth voices and bring them into 35 fellowships to do the reporting we'll call Generation TBD. Kevin Grant's going to go into it in much more depth and with much greater skill in explaining to you how the platform was built later today. But I do want to just share with you that sort of the overall framing of how we plan to do it. And I want to drill down now with the panel to really get at storytelling. How do we bring forward the stories of this generation? And maybe just ask each of you one question, and then we're going to go to the audience for questions. So start warming up for your questions, and we'll be right with you. Do we have a microphone somewhere to... Maybe we could set that up now while we do a sort of speed round with you guys. Wes, I wanted to ask you about, okay, here's a story, Ferguson. Enormous story. What story in America could be more important for capturing youth voices, for looking at how young people are feeling about law enforcement, about what what so many felt was a failure of our country to recognize that this police force is not representing them, to put it mildly. And I know from my experience in the newsroom, it's often so daunting. You almost feel like, how do you get at this? How did you physically leverage the resources of your news organization to really tell that story? What kind of sort of in-house leveraging did you have to do?
Of course, and so I think there are two parts to that, right? I think that I think it starts with that coverage in the immediate moment, right? And I think part of that is just showing up and doing your job the right way, right? And I think those first days on the ground that were stretched into the first months turned into, it started with me being the only reporter on the ground that we had for the first week or so, until at one point I got physically arrested and they had to send someone else too. But they we didn't have much of a choice then. But for a while, I was the only reporter on the ground. We had a photographer, and it became clear relatively quickly that this wasn't going to be the me drop in, do one daily story, then write a story for the weekend type thing, which is what I showed up with 3 shirts, right? I thought I was coming for 2 days, I'd do a quick breaking news thing, and then write some weekend newspaper piece, and do that type of thing. But I think that part of it is recognizing the story and recognizing, I think very often, especially in traditional media, we fall into these old constructs, right? That we break a story and then there's a follow-up the next day because this is just how our cycle works. So I show up and do a breaking news story and then there's a gather string for a weekend piece, right? We fall into specific constructs of what coverage is supposed to look like, and I think that very often leaves us out to dry, right? I think we have a lot of news organizations that are kicking themselves right now in Flint, Michigan, right? Because they showed up 6 months ago and did a piece, right? There was a front page piece, and then no one talked about Flint, Michigan again until, it was far too late. And journalism could have changed some of the outcomes there had we showed up more than once. And I think that was, I think that what we convinced the Post to do, myself and some of the other editors involved, was that we decided essentially that we wanted to drop into this place and we wanted to be the Metro newspaper. So we weren't competing with the New York Times to write the most swooping or flowery of piece. We weren't necessarily competing with the local coverage in terms of every little piecemeal update, right? Mm-hmm. This thing from this press conference. Rather, we were saying, how can we provide smart coverage that adds both perspective and context and asked hard questions of people who need to be asked hard questions in Ferguson by and large, right? And so we were doing stories about how the school system was being affected by what was going on in the school system broadly, things like transportation, things about segregation still in the city, right? How do we do the types of stories that a major news organization in this place should be doing? But then you have the second question, right? Because everyone was doing Ferguson stories in 2014 because it was the biggest domestic news story of the year. What do you do in 2015 that recognizes, because it's not just about creating media celebrities of some young people, right? It's not about showing up and saying, here, give me some quotes and I'll tweet you some stuff and now you have a bunch of attention and okay, cool, I'm going on the presidential trail now, right? It's about how do you validate these issues that have been raised by doing journalism that continues to ask hard questions in these spaces, right? And so we did in 2015, we essentially, when I first got to Ferguson, you had the civil rights group saying black men are being executed in the streets every day. And you had the police union saying this never happens, these are one-offs, this is complete. And smart editors, because they're smart editors, were saying, okay, can we do a nut graph? Are there some national stats on this? What do we know? And I was calling them back and saying, we have no idea. No one counts this thing. Yes, I understand I'm telling you that and it sounds ridiculous. No one has any idea how many people the police kill. That's ridiculous. And after 3 or 4 of those conversations, we all got to the same point where we said, yeah, it is ridiculous that no one knows how many people the police kill. Wait, we're a huge newspaper based in the nation's capital who can hold the federal government's feet to the fire on these types of things. And so we sat around a room and we said, why don't we count how many people the police kill? That's a type of, and we ended up doing, a project that incorporated maybe 30 or 40 different people around our newsroom, a massive data lift, as well as tons of policing analytical reporting that has changed some of the police reform conversation in policing spaces. I went to a conference of police chiefs 2 weeks ago, and they started with a PowerPoint presentation of our findings. I didn't know that coming into it, right? And so it was this idea of too often we cover stories as the story that's right in front of us, right? I'm dropping into a place for this dispatch from this mysterious land to Ferguson, Missouri, and here are these details of this specific interaction, right? But we don't live in a world where nothing is an isolated incident, right? Nothing is one thing unconnected from everything else. And so that's, I think, so important, is like making it imperative in newsrooms to cover stories, again, not just in the thing that happened today, but rather, what does this really mean when you zoom out to 10,000 feet? And what is for every Flint, then that's, I think Flint's another good example of that, right? You've got Flint, Michigan right now, but I'm sure that's not the only city in the country with water that's yellow and brown. And it's this idea of how do we cover these stories without just covering the granular of this story, but really saying, how is Flint, Michigan the story of America? How is Ferguson, Missouri the story of America?
All right, so first of all, the fact that your question of why can't we get an answer to how many people are being killed by police, that it was a sort of shocking enough question that it mobilized 30, 40 people to get on the team to do it. I don't want you to pass over that. That's like an amazing accomplishment and amazing work within a newsroom to sort of hold the newsroom accountable. I just want to applaud you on that for a minute. And then I wanted to ask you a question about, you said, I was the guy who could show up and I had a pad and I knew how to work a phone. What you're talking about is a kind of old school reporting, like old shoe leather reporting, that I am wondering if your colleagues, maybe who are younger than you, about your age, do they really have those skills? Do they really know how to do that?
I think there are more people who know how to do that than sometimes we believe that there are, and I also think that the only way you learn how to do that is by doing it. Right, I can say all those things. I was in college 3 years ago, right? It's not. And granted, I wouldn't have been in class. I would have been at the newspaper, right, doing these types of things, right? But I think there are. But I think that we have to remember that I think a lot of great reporters are created by great stories. That they're dropped into something and they have to figure out how to do it. Right. And they have to ask the questions. They have to take the notes and they have to figure out, how do I develop these skills, right? Cops reporters don't become great cops reporters because they were born to be cops reporters. It's because there's a crazy murder or a crazy rape or some terrible thing happens in their community and they have to do the work and learn how to do the work. And I think very often, I think right now there is such a large swath of really talented, really excited, really ambitious young people who want to do journalism that matters and want to change the world around them, right? I think that there is this, people kind of like worry about it sometimes, but I do think there's an activist streak to some extent in kind of some of the young ranks of reporting, this idea that people want to do work that is going to make a better world for where they live. And I think it's about kind of like harnessing that talent and thrusting those people into these positions. And again, by the time I got to Ferguson, I had been on staffs. I wasn't dropping in having never done reporting before, having never done breaking news. I'd been on national stories previously. But, I was working at the Washington Post already, right? I was already in a position where I'd proven that I could do some of this. But I do think, when I talk to young, other colleagues who are my age, I think there are a lot of people who have the passion. And I think in many ways that can be the most important thing.
Okay. Thanks. And I cannot tell you how excited I am that someone is still thinking of sort of cop reporting as this thing that can bring much larger stories. I shared with you where it led me to the Middle East, and I think it's really core. Azmat, you were talking about in Ghost Schools, truly extraordinary reporting, but I loved when you touched on some of the digital techniques you brought. Maybe you could tease them a little bit more forward as an investigative reporter, and you really need to share with us, where you were going is very dangerous. How did you do that?
Right. So actually one of the first things that I did before I left for Afghanistan was I acquired the GPS coordinates of every single education building.
How did you get those?
Through a source. So I can't get into too many details about that. I did also Freedom of Information Act requested.
For those GPS points?
Yes, exactly. For this database that I know exists. And I wasn't able to get it that way. I was able to get military records about schools via FOIA. But in this case, to my knowledge, I'm the only journalist who's been able to get that database. And so it was an incredible mapping point because it allowed me to figure out where schools were, plot them on a map, figure out where the best areas to go were based on the war for hearts and minds. And that's what I did. So that was really helpful in terms of planning. Obviously, there were a lot of tools that I used, both in the pre-trip planning as well as on the ground. You know, every night before I was set to go out to new schools the next day, I would, I'd go on Google Earth and I'd make sure that if anything happened, I could find my way back on my own. This wasn't just about, having a local driver just in case. You just need to be prepared. And in this way, digital tools were incredibly helpful. Being a lot of those photos, I think almost all of the photos that we saw were ones that I took myself on my iPhone. And so, that's great in terms of GPS location and being able to check metadata and making sure I'm at the right place. A lot of times the schools were not exactly where their GPS location was, but it was very helpful to me.
And your connectivity was solid enough in Afghanistan that you were able to actually take a photo and have a GPS coordinate?
It varied. So in some places, yes. In other places, no.
Were you using a sat phone? Or
I had a sat phone. I didn't always take it with me at all times, mainly because I was trying to go as low-key as possible when I traveled. And so, this is changing. But in many parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan as well, along the tribal areas, I try not to take a sat phone if I don't need one, because if you're caught with it and you look like you're just a local, it looks like you're a spy or something. And so in this case, that was it wasn't something I always had, but there were there was my phone, there were locals with their phones that had great connectivity. So if it wasn't Etisalat, it was another line. So not in every single place, but essentially all you need is the village name. You go there, and the people in this village will know the school. And so I had a range of data. I had contractor information, subcontractor information, and I was able to just trace, the people on the ground. I went with local individuals to each general area I was going to.
Did you have a cover story like, I'm just here looking at education in general or something? Or were you...
Yeah, no, I just said, hey, and actually talking my way into schools was arguably easier because I was a woman. If you're a woman in a car, in a burqa, you fly through checkpoints. Whereas if you're a male reporter, it's a little bit harder. For me, it was fairly easy to get through checkpoints and then getting to the school and telling them very honestly what I was looking at, which is, hey, I know this school was funded by the United States or by the military or USAID. I wanted to come in and take a look and see how this is functioning. I want to meet some of the students. And almost always people were quite welcoming. I remember that in Kandahar, which is where a majority of the schools I went to were, and is sort of the crux of the narrative in the story, if you read it, the education department, I started getting denied access, and the education department had me come in Kandahar city, and I had to get a formal letter with their approval to go to schools, but I didn't let them dictate which ones I would go to, or they didn't know when I was going. And that letter facilitated, going to many of the schools that I went to, so that was helpful. So it was a negotiation of access and a lot of planning, planning to make sure, A, that I was safe, and B, that this wasn't set up in advance.
How about training? How about hostile environment training?
Yes, so I did do a course shortly before leaving. I've had training in the past. In this case, I did global journalist security with Frank Smith. Exactly. Yes, yeah. And so that was helpful. I think that anybody who wants to do something like this should get that. I also think that you can't underestimate as much specific local context as possible. And so that included, for any trip I would be making, mapping out the local power players, whether or not I was going to see them, making sure I knew who the local strongmen were, if I even needed help, if I even wanted to avoid them, what I had to do to know how to keep myself safe. So everything was just a lot of research, calling up people from these areas that I could trust, and learning as much as I could. You can't jump into something like that without doing a lot of planning.
And how long were you on the story?
It took 7 months from start to finish.
Congratulations. It's extraordinary work. Hillary, I wanted to ask you about this idea of taking something sort of as static and predictable as a debate, backing up, trying to find a way to do it new. Where do you take it now? How do you continue to bring forward the stories of young young people, voices that need to be heard in this election, that are very hard for pollsters and demographers to get their arms around a millennial generation that wants to defy categories, and it's very unpredictable. How do you quantify, and how do you tell the narratives that need to be told?
There are a couple of different ways that we're doing it. I think, you see a lot of news organizations sort of announce some overarching, like, it's your voice, your vote, you're this, you're that.
Right.
Like, that's our 2016 plan. And we actually developed a project-based approach to the election. So we have these sort of like core points that we're trying to hit all the time. Yeah, we're always looking at issues, and those issues are the issues that matter to our audience. So immigration, racial and social justice, education, student loans, reproductive health. We're not really doing national security. Like, it's just not something that's like in our day-to-day vernacular. We do a little bit of it, but kind of where it intersects with specific things that we know our core is talking about. And then we sort of take those issues and we figure out how to address them through these different projects. So one project, which I know you're familiar with, is our Dear Next President project, which is a very simple concept where we're going all over the country, partnering with groups like Everytown for Gun Violence. We're going to Charleston next week. Collier Meyerson, one of our great young reporters, is spending a week in Charleston following up with the AME Church, different people, survivors, family members, church members in that community, to talk to them about 2016, what matters to them post the events in Charleston, what are they looking to hear from these candidates. But we'll also be shooting a series of these videos we call Dear Next President, which are very simple. We ask people to complete the phrase, Dear Next President, I want you to X, or please do X. It's been great because we do them on college campuses. We do them everywhere, but we also had, like, Nas did one. We've had, lots of famous people participate also. So
I don't want to say we're going to rip off, but we plan to replicate something very similar. I think it's such a
we can
really,
just partner,
truly,
and you can just make Dear Next President.
I love that.
That would be good.
No, I truly, truly love the way you've structured the single question to many voices. It's a beautiful form of storytelling. Do you feel it takes you deep enough?
Well, I think on an individual basis, it sort of depends on what you're looking for. So if it's a celebrity, it can be interesting because they go on a little longer, and seeing sort of how they describe what they care about can be interesting if you care about that person. I think one of the things when we launched the project, I thought it was going to be a UGC campaign, and that we would put out a call to people and they would make these videos, and we'd have thousands of them come in from across the country. And that just doesn't work, because getting people to pick up a phone, the video is very hard. It's easier to have people. There are a lot of different ways to spur people, but I think video is especially difficult. You look at, like, the Ice Bucket Challenge, that had a gamified component. It had a different motivation, and it was so hooked to kids doing it, and cuteness and Facebook and all that stuff. Right. It was hugely successful. Dear Next President doesn't quite operate that way. So we realized that was okay, though. So we don't really push that part of it. Instead, what we do is try to partner with groups that we're interested in, whether it's the NAACP or, like I said, Everytown for Gun Violence, and we take some of their voices and we craft them into beautiful videos, and sort of like short supercuts. My favorite was one that actually aired at the Brown Black Forum that we did in a school in Des Moines with a number of undocumented kids who were afraid for their parents' status, for their own status, for their own futures, and teachers who were very committed to this community. And one of the women that we asked to participate was too shy to say Dear Next President, but she loves to sing, and she sang the national anthem, and we used that as the soundtrack for these voices. And so, something that Wesley said really resonated with me, which is when he talked about using the Post to sort of amplify, the platform of the Post to amplify these voices. I think for us, we have reporters who are going out and seeking those voices for sure, but we've really tried to open things up and feature people speaking for themselves, and that can be a 10-year-old or, the whole way up the age chain. But really, we want to capture those 18 to 35 voices in a really, really visceral way. And just like one thing I want to say about the forum, because I didn't say it before, the way we really differentiated that was by 3 of our moderators of 4. Jorge Ramos, of course, was one of them, but the other 4 were under 35. We had 2 Latina, 2 African American, 2 who had never really done TV before. We didn't care. It doesn't matter to us. What mattered was the authenticity of that event. We also had students participate, including one from Drake. They wrote their own questions. I worked with them on them. We didn't feed them questions to ask. We let them speak, pose questions to these candidates. And the young woman who addressed Hillary Clinton asked her how she felt about, had she ever benefited from white privilege before? And this was like the explosive question that is still spinning out in different people's stories. And that question only would have come from a student. We were not going to write that question with our moderating team. As much as we tried to push the boundaries on question asking, it had to come from her voice, her experience. And it ended up being like the most talked about point of that whole evening. Right. So it was really a really important lesson, I think, for us and for the networks to see how we did that.
It's amazing work, and it's such a simple idea to get sort of a reporting team that reflects the community you're covering, that seeks to have young journalists find the voices of young people and the stories of young people that need to be told. And yeah, we do really look forward to partnering more with you. So
cool.
Yeah, thank you. We have some questions, I'm sure, from the audience, I would hope. If you do, there's a microphone right here, and there's a microphone here. Anybody? One thing I'll throw out is this platform we're creating. We today, over lunch, over the other discussions you'll hear, any intersection you have, we'd love to hear from you. You can find us by our badges. You can seek out the RTI team. Let us know what you think about this platform. How can we do it better? What are we missing? I invite the panel to be part of that discussion too. Does anybody have a question? We have about 10 minutes before we need to break for coffee. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, my question is for Wesley.
Eric, I might say, do you want to introduce yourself? Yeah. And you're a big part of this partnership?
I'm Eric Johnson. I'm with RTI. I've been working with Charlie and Kevin and others in the center to launch this platform, and super excited about today. And Wesley, one of the questions we get a lot about the platform and what we're trying to do is the do no harm question, and are you putting youth up in a way that they're unprepared for, and then you leave the next day and they deal with the ramifications. And I think in Ferguson we saw a decent amount of that, right, where people were speaking up for Mike Brown and maybe not in a way that the mainstream consumer of that media expected to hear it articulated or said. And I think there were some pretty atrocious cases, in fact. And so what was your take on that, and what would your advice for us be on elevating voices and protecting those voices?
Of course. I mean, I think that, one of the things, it's funny actually, because I didn't consume a lot of Ferguson coverage in real time, and so a lot of my knowledge of how Ferguson was covered by at large has come since then, like going back and I literally wasn't watching any cable news because I was in Ferguson. And so but I've gone back pretty methodically through most of the coverage, and I think that, one of the things I think is important to remember in these cases is in that type of situation specifically, right, is to very often we're journalistically inclined to try to find characters on which to hang our entire narrative, right? And so we saw this in Ferguson a lot, where there's this immediate question of like, who's leading these protests? Who are the people? Who are the thing? There's still like this broad kind of societal misunderstanding that like 4 or 5 people got all these people out of their houses. Like, no, there's no 5 people if you remove them from any of these protests that would have prevented any of these protests from happening, right? These were all, both in Ferguson, in Baltimore, in most of the places that I've seen, in Chicago and Minneapolis, most of these are not deeply like community organized events. Rather, they are like a volcanic eruption of deep systemic frustration, right? And so I think that very often what ends up happening is we are inclined in the media to try to tell these stories through 3 or 4 people specifically. And you see this on both sides, right? You see like the anointing of like, these are the new civil rights leaders, these are the people, which becomes like potentially problematic. 1, because they're all divisive characters even within their spaces. 2, because these are not quite things that can be like achieve, no one organized this event or this thing. Everyone kind of disagrees about what should happen next. And then you see this also in kind of like partisan media, especially partisan media that feels itself inclined to oppose the types of things that the young people are calling for, right? And so you start to see this, in Ferguson, I think very often of a guy I know very well, Bassem Mazari, who was a live streamer. And he's a Palestinian guy, he's a live streamer, former heroin addict who found this kind of community through the protests. But he would live stream and say like the most disgusting things you've ever heard say to a police officer constantly. So he became a mainstay on Fox News. He was constantly like put out as like the face of this thing. See, this is what they want. It's this guy. And he actually ended up becoming like a very moderate, like very relatively like sober voice by the end, having gone through all of this. He's like, oh, I guess you're right. I shouldn't have said all this stuff. Yeah, this is weird. They're still playing on loop that thing I said on day 1 of the protest and it's day 100, right? And so you saw the, very often these like straw men being set up to be knocked down. Like, how can we find the objectionable person in this space so we can devalidate the entire space? And I think but I also think you see that on the other end. Like, how can we find the most respectable person in this space? The media does this very often, so that we can feel like we're validating the space, but I think that also sometimes devalidates the space, right? And I think that, and so it's just, I think it's, again, all of it is like dropping into these places and trying to understand what we don't know. Like, I remember a time, maybe a month, it was probably after the grand jury decision, so like 3 months into what's been 18 months of this conversation. And there was this like, and there's all this kind of commentary class about, well, what this potential movement needs, or what these people need, or what they should be doing, or why haven't they? And I remember tweeting something along the lines of like, it's just like fascinating how many of us find ourselves believing we are like experts in like civil rights movements or social movements or protest movements, right? Or this idea that like what worked in one capacity is the only thing that can work in this capacity. And I think that very often like we have to remember that like there's so much pressure now, both with the online, with the desire to be both analysts and authorities in social spaces, as well as the appetite that people have for news. There's such a pressure now to give this type of authoritative analysis of all things at all times that I think a lot of reporters didn't necessarily experience historically. And I think that while I think it's important to be telling readers what we know or what I know from my experience in these spaces, I think it's equally important to remember what we don't know, right? That like, I don't know what is going to happen with this thing. And so I can't, and I think that very often we see this in politics a lot, like reporters think they're political strategists. Like we think we know what, and we see this all the time. We see this in 2016 all the time. Like, this is gonna be the thing that sinks Trump, or this is and it's all like nonsensical and it's all wrong, right? Because you cover something for a long time and you start to think you're the expert. Like, there's no political reporter who doesn't think he or she could get elected to office. They all think they could run one of these campaigns, right? And I think that in this,
I just want to do a split screen with CNN right now in New Hampshire, and I think they have a lot to learn from you.
And so I think it's just important to remember. Like, I'm not leading the protest for a reason, right? And I think that that's something that's important to be remembered by anyone who's coming into these spaces.
Thank you. Great answer. Yeah.
I have a question for Azmat. So you're covering a very complicated social situation in Afghanistan. A lot of powerful interests there, and they're trying to win the hearts and minds of the society. How do you achieve, this is important not just from your coverage, but also in terms of thinking about training future journalists. How do you try to achieve balance in telling your story? Because there's always two sides to every story. At the same time, you're trying to expose a very real, profound problem in that society. And winning the hearts and minds is always in the forefront of anything in terms of major developmental changes. So how do you achieve balance in your quest to also reveal and inform?
So I actually want to sort of go back to a mantra I first learned at Frontline that's really important to me, and it's that this isn't about balance, it's about being fair. So being fair isn't necessarily here's side A, here's side B. And for me, the way to achieve fairness was to do as great of to as well as I could do it, portray the good intentions, the good efforts that went into these programs, and the incredibly hard work. Because what you saw just now was the overwhelming majority of what I saw. So the question is, if this is what I'm finding, how did it get this way? And in this case, I chose to tell the story. You know, I had many potential main narratives to weave through this. And I actually picked one that was more sort of a middle ground end result. It wasn't an absolute failure. The school was functioning. The problem was that, you know, the roof was it was leaking on the students, and, you know, the contract that was eventually awarded to, you know, a local strongman in exchange for, you know, he donated the land in exchange for a contract to build a health clinic next to the building. So these things happened, but you also have a school that, by all accounts, including the one of the soldier who began it, is incredibly successful given the local circumstances. And so what I did was try to spell that out as clearly as possible, A, and B, to draw out the bigger picture. And so you'll see if you read the story, here's a guy who gets to this area where there has not been a school for generations, possibly ever. And, you know, on his own time, he's a soldier, an officer in the Army, and he decides, you know, I'm going to start tutoring these kids. I learned Pashto at Fort Drum. You know, I can teach them the alphabet. We can get started. He gets a little bit of money from this CERP program that the military has, and it sort of evolves from there into what is today a full-fledged school. Yes, the contract may have gone to a warlord, but here's how that happened. And so there's a lot of historical context local to that area. And then there's also, well, let's step out and let's look at what happened and how this came to be. And a large part of it was the fact that political and military goals became critical to these programs. So even if this was about educating Afghan children, it was also about political and military goals that sometimes superseded other factors on the ground. It meant working with that man you didn't want to work with.
Great question, and the answer reveals something that's missing a lot from journalism today, which is structural fairness. Finding the characters who can really allow you to tell the story with a dramatic narrative, but get at all sides, get at how you're really going to do it. And your project succeeded in that. We're going to break because I think everybody needs a cup of coffee a little bit further. Oh, I'm sorry, we have one more question? We do. It's going to cut in on coffee time, so we might have to make this one quick, but thank you. Okay.
That's the answer.
You're going to give us a joke anyway.
Alejandro Crawford, Acceleration Group. I wanted to pick up on this question that you raised, Wesley, and then you just picked up about which voices we privilege, right? From the point of view of creating a compelling narrative versus hearing the different voices, the various voices in the community. And particularly, Hillary, I know you mentioned with the Dear Next President campaign that it wasn't as if you had thousands of entries and you're having to pick. But obviously in the digital age, we have several tools. We have curatorial tools, right? We have rating by the crowd of which responses are important and several others. And I know with Youth Voices, there is this objective to bring out voices we haven't been hearing from. So I wanted to hear, in your experience with Fusion, but also from each of you, how you're thinking about which of these new voices we're going to bring forward and whether the criteria will be based on the crowd, right? They love the Hillary, have you benefited from white privilege question, whether they'll be from the crowd or whether there'll be an element of selectivity to improve the stories or get past certain protections that the military may have on how it spent money.
Great question. Thank you.
I think for us, oh, I feel like I just got really loud. Sorry. You know, there are a couple different ways I would address that. One is like in the sense of building our own newsroom. We're looking, which is sort of where we start with new voices, who are going out and finding the voices to bring into our stories. We look for, you know, young people with some experience who have been emerging as authentic voices in social media. So more than, I mean, that's new. This is not just like somebody recommends someone to you and they went to grad school here or they did X, Y, and Z. We're really looking at, does this person embody in their social media life what Fusion stands for? Do they care about social justice? Do they care about pop culture through identity? Like, what would bring them to us? Are they experimenting with storytelling tools in an interesting way? So there's kind of a bar there, I think, just as how we build our staff. And then because that's the staff that's creating these projects, it sort of trickles down in various ways. So When it comes to things like Dear Next President, I mean, we edit those. We would never put a voice out there in a supercut or on a social account that was saying something irresponsible that we know they didn't want to say, that they were too young that they didn't realize what they were saying. Like, we wouldn't do that. We might, if we think they had something to say and didn't quite say it the way that maybe it should have come out, we'll help them with it. We can do a second take. We can go back. That hasn't really happened, but they're definitely in that situation. But I think one of the things as we put together these, what we call supercuts of Dear Next President, they're between 1 minute and 2 minute long. They feature anywhere between like 7 and 10 voices on an issue or from an organization or however they're thematically linked. We bring them together to create a story so that all those voices are telling a story together. It's really not one person standing out on their own. So I think in that way, even though we're leveraging just voices of the people and especially of young people, we're putting them in a context where they're sort of packaged and protected by that context.
Thank you. I wanted to just end with something that I sometimes begin introducing Ground Truth with, but I wanted you to hear Ground Truth, and then I wanted to explain to you the origin of the term, because each of our 3 panelists are what we would call practitioners of Ground Truth. How many of you, I mean, the word's kind of obvious, Ground Truth, but how many of you have ever heard of the real scientific application of the term? So I first heard the word ground truth on an embed, on a military embed. And one of the commanders said to me, you know, it's a real term. I mean, look it up. It means something. And I did look it up. And it was coined by NASA. And what I love about ground truth, and the reason we call ourselves ground truth, is because ground truth is an attempt to calibrate and focus on a satellite technology. So it's taking the pixels of the digital age. And I think all of us feel sometimes bombarded by too much information, too much digital information coming at us. Ground truth is the discipline of a person going to a patch of earth about 10 square yards with a very intense optic and focusing on that patch of earth, getting a very clear reading on exactly what it says so that it can be calibrated against the satellite image in the sky, in space. And you can begin to clarify and adjust, focus. And that's really what all 3 of our panelists do. They are ground truthers. They are people who go out and look at the story very carefully and then help us align the pixels so that we can really calibrate and understand a very complicated world. That is ground truth, and that is very much the intention of Youth Voices, to take the pixels of many stories and then try to bring them into focus and find the right stories to tell. So we have 2 things I want to do. I want to first thank our panelists. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you guys. The other thing we're going to do is just say that we have a really great event coming up. You have about 6 minutes to get coffee. And we're going to then go into Steve Grove, the director of Google News Lab, will be leading youth interviews. So really good one coming up. Coffee break. Thank you very much.
Really try to stick to it. We have over 100 people online and then youth coming in from around the world. And
so we should make it 5.
Make it 5 minutes. Stand and stretch. So we have young people who are videoing in from around the world, and it's late in the evening in a couple of their situations. I want to be respectful of their time, and we also have Steve Grove from Google, who's got a busy schedule. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Eric Johnson. I'm with RTI International. It's an exciting day for us. It's my privilege to launch this Google Hangout with a good friend of mine, Steve Grove, who's the executive director of Google's News Lab. I'll let Steve tell you about Google News Lab, but I'll just say that Steve and I grew up in the same small town in Minnesota. We're old friends, and highly appreciative of you, Steve, of taking the time to be with us today and lead this this conversation with young people from around the world. So I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Steve.
Great, thanks, Eric, and hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Give me a thumbs up that we're in good shape. All right, excellent. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Eric. Thanks so much for having me and RTI for hosting this event. I'm joined in this hangout by 3 young people from around the world. We're all meeting in here today. Actually, I think if you could put it on mute, everyone, if you're not talking, I think there might be some feedback noise coming in. There we go. So I'm coming to you from Mountain View, which is where Google is. I run a team called the Google News Lab, and we're focused on collaborating with journalists and entrepreneurs around the world to build the future of media with Google through our tools, through our data, and through programs that we create in conjunction with news organizations. So it's really a pleasure for me to host this Hangout and get to talk with the 4 wonderful panelists we have with us today. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to dive right into some questions about their experiences tackling youth unemployment in their countries. So first we have Noku, who's coming to us from South Africa. Noku, give a wave.
Hi.
That's Noku. We also have Juan, who's coming to us, I think, from Spain. Is that right, Juan?
Yes, from Spain. Hello. Hola.
Spain. We have Meki, who's coming to us from Morocco. His connection is a little spotty. Hang on. Hey, Meki.
Hello, everyone.
All righty. And I think last we have Dina. And Dina, we didn't get a chance to talk before. I know you're from Mexico, but you might be coming to us from Boston. Is that right? Dina, you might be on mute. Okay, well, Dina, we'll get back to you in a moment. Make sure you unclick mute before you talk, because Google Hangout technology is exciting, but sometimes a little bit complicated. Well, let's dive right in. And Noku, I'm going to start with you. You live in South Africa, where the unemployment rate for people between 15 and 30 is about 52%, so pretty high in South Africa. Tell us a little bit about your story. You grew up in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. What was life like for you growing up?
So I grew up in a very deep rural community in KZN, KwaZulu-Natal. It meant that there was absolutely no electricity, no running water. So I went to primary and secondary school there. For about 12 years in my basic education, I had no access to a library, and I only got to basically have access to a laptop at the age of 14 while doing grade 10 in secondary school. So then that's basically the reality of many of South Africans who grow up in rural areas. So that is my background information. So after matriculating, then I went to the University of KwaZulu-Natal to study for Bachelor of Social Science, and I ended up graduating with Bachelor of Social Science honors after 4 years of varsity.
So you hadn't seen a laptop until you were in 10th grade?
Yes, at the age of 14.
So when you went on to college, what was your hope? What did you hope to do when you graduated from school?
After graduating from school, I wanted to do anything communication related, because I had studied social science and majored in communication. And I have to say, Steve, at this point that my first year at varsity, the results were dismal, because obviously because of the disconnect and the fact that I didn't have access to a library. So it was really hard for me getting to university and learning to converse in English and all that stuff. It was really difficult. So after graduating, I was really hoping to have that confidence to go out in the world and go into a communication.
One second, you said Hey, Mickey, would you mind hitting mute on your Hangout? Mickey, can you hear me? If you could hit mute.
Yes.
If you could please just hit mute, and then we'll go back to you in a second because I think it's giving a little bit of feedback. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Noku, sorry, please continue.
No, sure. So I was hoping to get into a communication background. In any company, I was really looking forward to do an online media sort of role in a company. So that was what I was looking for when I graduated back in 2010.
And the job market, what was it like? Was it hard to find a job? Easy to find a job?
So basically after graduating, I spent 2 unrewarding years looking for work. The first challenge that I found is that looking for work was really difficult in a sense that it was expensive. I didn't have access to a laptop at home, so this like the basic things like mailing your resume out and actually getting access to the job opportunities because you've got to have a network of some sort to have access to the opportunities that exist. So I didn't have enough of that. I had also little knowledge as to how to effectively look for work. So the 2 years between 2010 graduating and the end of 2012 when I found something that was really difficult for me because I didn't understand that I was not looking for work effectively until the point when I actually found out what is it that it actually takes to get a job. So it was really difficult for me because I had no knowledge whatsoever.
Well, you ended up at Harambee, which is a youth employment organization in South Africa.
Yes.
Tell us a little about what that organization is doing to help young people find jobs in South Africa, young people just like you were when you came out of college.
Okay, so what Harambee does is it offers like a short and experience-based and an employer tailored sort of intervention for young people. So what they did for me is they found me a job after putting me on an 8-week sort of work readiness program. So what they do is during the 8 weeks, they sort of simulate a work environment and they help us to they help us to actually get the soft skills. It's sort of hone your soft skills. Like I didn't understand why was it important to come to work and show up as energetic, show the curiosity and the integrity. And what the 8 weeks sort of bridge did was to introduce me to those winning behaviors in the work environment. So that is what Harambee does. So it sort of matches people based in on their behaviors and their performance during the 8 weeks to the right sort of to the right sort of job opportunities that exist out there. So it takes them directly to the employer, and then it's up to them when they get there to actually work really hard on interview and get the job opportunities.
That's interesting. So it's less actual sector-based education and more some of the soft skills that help someone land a job. I want to move to Dina next. Dina, you've taken a different approach with your organization, Deportes para Compartir, if I'm saying it right. It's sports for sharing in English.
Yes.
Tell us a little about the insights behind your organization and what you're doing.
Absolutely. So I started with one friend almost 9 years ago from scratch. We wanted to work with children to form better citizens from very young ages through the power of play and sports. And at that time, all my peers from university didn't believe that this could be a job, and they were wondering, so Dina, what are you really going to do for work? And I said, I'm going to work with children through sports, and they had a hard time believing that was something serious.
Why sport?
So why sport? Because I believe all children have a huge amount of energy, including myself when I was one. And I think it's really up to how do you channel that energy, and what do you do with that energy that really counts. So you can use it to to be a bully or to do all sorts of like not so useful things, or you can use it to build and to activate your citizenship since you're a very young person. So now, after 9 years, we have created hundreds of jobs. We currently have 80 full-time staff in our team, which we're very proud of, because
so why don't you tell us just a second. So what kids play games all the time. What's unique about Sports for Sharing's approach as it relates to getting kids to play games? What are you trying to teach these students through your program?
Yes. So what's unique is we translate very abstract concepts like civic values, such as empathy or gender equality, teamwork, fair play. We translate them into actual games where children play about why is it important for them to practice these kind of values in their everyday lives, and also relate them to global challenges such as Sustainable Development Goals from UN. So children are getting a hold of why do they care about the environment or about poverty or gender equality in very practical terms. It's tangible. And so they become change makers through these activities where they are having fun, they're getting involved in healthy activities and getting to also come up with their own conclusions instead of having the regular class where you sit down and it's very passive. It's a different way of learning.
And how do you think? Explain how this helps students find work in Mexico after they go through your program.
Yes. So first of all, we are working with elementary school children, but it's very interesting because those children are gaining a lot of self-confidence and understanding that they can become change makers locally. They can create projects. We have a methodology to do project management for children, and also we employ youth to follow up in the communities that we work at. So these are local facilitators that just came out of university, and this is their first job, and they usually cannot find a job because they don't have the experience, and they don't have the experience because no one gives them a job. So we are creating jobs, and I'm very also proud to say that you can create your own job. That has been my experience as a social entrepreneur, and I would invite everyone in the audience to think about the possibilities that they have to create their own jobs, doing something that's meaningful and that where they believe in a lot.
Excellent. I want to move on to Meki, who's in Morocco. Meki, if you can unmute your Hangout now, and if you are able to turn on your camera, we can see you. There we go.
Okay, it's done.
So I was reading a little bit about your background before this chat, and I think similar to Noku, you had some trouble finding work when you were coming out of university. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
So, first of all, I thank you, all the team there, for this event. It's exciting to share our ideas and our life with other youth from other regions of the world. So, for me, I joined public schools, primary schools, high schools, and also the university. I never felt this importance of having much more skills than what we learn at university or at schools after the Bachelor of Arts. So I was one of thousands of youth, Moroccan youth. After they get a bachelor degree, they went to university or other schools. It's something that we are doing here in Morocco. It's like when you have a better degree, you can have a good jobs, and it's not the case for these days. Maybe it was the case in the 60s or the 80s, but now it totally changed. So for me, I spent, I think, 7 years at university to have a Bachelor of Arts, and after that, I had the chance to be enrolled in master degree. But before this, when I have my Bachelor of Arts, as you know, I am the eldest of my siblings, so like the case of many people, for me, the children are the investments of their parents. You know, when you get a certain age, you have to work and maybe to pay back for the
Oh, Meki, can you hear us?
family.
Meki, can you? I think the connection might be a little spotty. Can you hear us, Meki? All right, why don't we move on to Juan and hope that Meki's able to.
To help the other siblings.
So I think
maybe without video.
I think we're gonna have to put Meki on mute just for now. I hope we get him back. Wait, there he is. Meki, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Meki, why don't you kill your video, click the video icon up top, and that might reduce the bandwidth and allow us to hear you better. Can you see that little video? Turn your camera off and maybe we can hear you. While he's doing that, I want to move on to you, Juan. Juan, you're in Spain.
Yes.
And you know, you are a journalist, you're a filmmaker. We'd love to hear about your experiences in Spain. I know in Spain the unemployment rate is almost 60% for young people. It's very high. I think oftentimes people might tend to think, oh, this is a problem that happens in developing countries, but even in Europe we face big unemployment challenges for young people. You've been documenting some of this through your journalism. Tell us what you found.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me, and sorry because of my English. I'm Spanish. So yeah, in 2014 I spent decent time documenting stories about youth unemployment. We got all kinds of stories, but I think one of the main problems that we have here is that we have a massive surplus of young people with superior studies that they don't have jobs, right? And we've been experiencing as a country like exodus to all over the world, right? Of young people. But I wanted to talk about an interesting phenomenon that I got in touch with in this year. This months of documenting these issues, and they're the so-called ninis, that in English is translated neither nor. So they're young people that they neither work nor study. They obviously don't work because they don't have a job, but they don't study because, they feel like, why I'm going to study or pursue the best marks in my, in my studies if after that I'm going to get nothing, right? So they live in this sort of like fog of like demotivation, and this is helped because because we have a culture of also staying longer in our parents' place. We sort of grow later than other cultures, maybe. So this is a very interesting phenomenon that happens all over Spain that I haven't seen anywhere in the world, and it's quite interesting. I did a story of one of them. It was, this guy was a very beautiful human being, but he was in a total like a limbo, right? Like not doing anything.
So not even, and then just sort of essentially giving up, it sounds like, deciding not to pursue education or training to things, but just.
Yeah, but another interesting thing is, for example, this last year I went to Rwanda for a month and a half in Africa, and I was documenting the youth and this like this recovery of today of the country, and I never found profiles like that. So these could be this sort of neither nor stuff. This could be like something of our first world sort of, right?
Interesting. I wonder, for all of you, the role that, and I think Dina mentioned it briefly a bit ago, the role that entrepreneurship can play in youth unemployment. Juan, why don't we start with you, since you're just about things in Spain. Do you feel like there's a culture of startups in Spain that young people, young Spanish folks can have access to capital and start their own businesses if the job market might not have opportunities for them?
Yes. Yeah, totally. Actually, startups have been like exploding and going up since the economical crisis began, and we've seen a massive rise on like startups here and there everywhere growing up. And
Google actually just started a campus in Madrid to house startups who are Spanish startups there. Do you, do you think that there's a lot of investment in Spain, money flowing into the startup ecosystem that helps young people think about that as a viable option?
Do you mean money from the outside?
No, I mean like Spanish venture capital or investors.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about that. I know there is capital. I mean, coming into this into the startup world for sure, but I don't know if it's Spanish or from outside, right?
Dina, you started your own organization, obviously, Sports for Sharing, in Mexico.
Yes.
Was that easy to do, hard to do? Do you think more young looking for work can take the startup path?
I think it's I wouldn't call it easy or difficult. It involves a lot of work, and it involves, actually, I think the most important is someone believing in you other than yourself. And I was really fortunate to have organizations like the International Youth Foundation who believed in the work that young entrepreneurs are doing, and they give you a lot of tools and a lot of networks, and it's just a matter of really knowing that what you're doing is also appreciated let's say by others than yourself. So I think it is absolutely possible.
Let me ask all of you this, because I know we're coming up on time here. What's one thing you wish employers in your country knew about the young people in your country when looking? Let's start with you, Noku.
Sorry, can you say that again, Steve?
What's something that you wish that South African businesses or employers knew about your generation and young people? Maybe change their perspective or enlighten them about the possibility of hiring younger folks?
So what I've found is that most employers out there look for experience, and I don't think it's actually a very good measure to say that someone is able to do work. What I would like for employers out there and the government to realize about the young South Africans today is they're very determined, like a group of cohorts that are looking for work. They have potential, and I see them working with them now at Harambee. Each and every day I see people with tons of energy that are coming through, and they have this tenacity about them. They don't allow for anything to get them down. So what I would like for employers out there to realize is that they're dealing with young people. As much as they're educated, all they need is just someone to give them that one chance to prove that they can actually do this. That's all they're looking for. just give them one opportunity and they run with it. That's it.
Yeah. Sorry, I can say anything. Yeah, that's what I saw in Rwanda too. Exactly that. Like people with this massive energy and hope and willingness to just try, right? And
yes.
That thing, I haven't seen it quite as much in, for example, my country. There's like more laziness or something. I don't know. It's different, quite different. Yeah.
Dean, how about you?
I believe the most important asset we have, which is, as my peers are saying, it's the energy, the potential, is the will to do something. So that's why I relate so much to the idea of doing something on your own. You don't need to necessarily be hired. You can organize and team up with like-minded individuals in your community. There always are, and go for it. If you have a clear idea and a sense of what's meaningful to you in your life, I think we all have the potential to do it.
Excellent. Well, I think that's about all the time that we have. And Meki, I think it's going to be tough to get back to you. I get good sound feedback from you. But I did want to thank you and everyone else on the panel, Noku, Dino, Juan, Meki, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You know, you took a lot of time out of your schedules at crazy hours of the day to join us. We appreciate it. I know we just kind of skimmed the surface of these four folks' backgrounds and ideas. Please check out their bios and their organizations in the packet. There's much more to learn there. And please keep up the great work telling the stories and building the communities that you live in. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We have one last segment before the end of the day. We're going to have my colleague Peter Joyce and then Kevin Grant from the GroundTruth Project and Alex Perlman, who is running the site and developing the site, and we're going to launch it here. Like Charlie said, it's in beta. I think we got access to the technology and license to the technology about 3 weeks ago. And so we've been building it, and we look forward to showing it to you and answering your questions about the site. So come on up, Peter and Kevin. Let's do chairs. Huh?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Three, yeah.
I'm going to stand.
Oh, you're going to stand? Okay.
No, I'll stand.
So, Kevin, I don't know. I mean, if you want to start, and we've got it up on the screen, and you know, maybe start with explaining what the site looks like and how it's going to operate and the questions and all that.
Great. So I've prepared some canned remarks that I'll read briefly, and then I'll improvise, okay? So first, I just want to thank everybody at RTI who's participated today. Something I think that hasn't quite gotten as much love in the conversation so far, although we've had great conversation and many interesting voices, is the Global Center for Youth Employment, right? This is a huge initiative with huge potential. And so we're launching Youth Voices in part as a way to leverage the Global Center and the amazing memberships and the young people, some of whom you've just heard from, the kinds of stories that are all, you know, around the world, which we don't necessarily hear. And Hillary, I think you made a great point in the first panel about the fact that a user-generated content platform alone is not enough. So Youth Voices being something that we think has the power to really attract lots of great stories, but that alone is not enough. So I just want to say also that Alex Perlman, who's in the back there and is going to be showing part of the rest of the demo here, she actually built a lot of this site. It was a real privilege to be able to work with members of the Guardians technology team. They actually created the technology that this runs on. So I want to say also that the inspiration for the project has always been a drive to empower young people around the world to tell their own stories. That's what GroundTruth does. That's what we've been doing for years, is really getting out into the world, as you've already heard, and working with young people and finding ways to sort of articulate stories that are not necessarily easy to say. I mean, you can see this even in the programming so far. It's sort of hard to put your finger on it sometimes. I have a problem. I can't quite get what I want. I have a dream. and yet how do I get there? And so sometimes it does take a sort of professional layer. It does take a professional storyteller to actually team up with a young voice to help turn an idea into a story that then can turn into action. So we've designed youth voices so that sharing stories is very easy to do, right? We want someone to be able to go onto this platform and very easily contribute. We're asking for a little bit of information about the person. We're asking for little snippets here, bits and pieces. It can be as simple as an Instagram photo, as a little bit of video, as a short piece of text. And we've built the platform as well so that there is an editorial layer. We are very respectful of this idea that someone can post something and overnight it can change their life. And so we do want to be very thoughtful, and we have built this to be very thoughtful about how exactly that happens. So every single story will be moderated before it appears on the web. So part of the process as well is to make sure that after we have sort of hit this very ambitious goal of 10,000 stories, that's what we want to use the center to sort of help us achieve, right? And we think there's something sort of poetic and beautiful about the idea of 10,000 stories of young people around the world talking about youth unemployment, talking about, in this case, for our very first question, what is your dream job? That we wanted to try and find a way to tap into some of the optimism as well as some of the pessimism around youth unemployment and all the related economic challenges. So today, along with launching the beta version of this site, which, as Charlie said, and we're hearing, it's beta. The whole idea is to get something out there, get something live, so that we can start kicking the tires, we can start improving upon it, and we can start building it over time. So please do bear with us as you see things that you go, you know what, that could be better. We know, and we agree. And we want to work with you all to improve it. So we think another aspect of this, aside from asking the question, what is your dream job, and what is standing in your way, which is important too, is to try to create a community of storytellers around this initiative. So you've seen that we have a lot of really great media partners here. We have great NGOs. We have great academics in the room. We have all kinds of people who care and who are doing different things on this project, on this problem right now. We feel that we can really build a community, a la Facebook perhaps not quite so grand, but something in which we actually can bring people together to talk, to share stories, and then to choose some of those stories for sort of further development. And so you heard about the 35 under 35. After the deadline of this first campaign, which is April 30th, we will have a team of sort of blue ribbon judges who will go through some of the very best of these stories. And for us, best doesn't mean, oh, it's perfect, oh, that story doesn't need to be touched. In fact, it has potential, and we've heard a lot about that too today. It starts with an idea, it starts with somebody besides yourself, as was just very well said, believing that you have potential, that you can do something. So we as journalists, we actually have the power to make that happen too. And you heard from Wesley Lowery from the Washington Post. We need to take that responsibility very seriously, and we do. But we're also going to sort of wade into some interesting waters here by creating a sort of hybrid of new technology that's a little unfamiliar but has a lot of power, and then these traditional journalistic values that I know GroundTruth shares, and I know our partners at RTI and the Center respect. Meanwhile, we're learning a lot from the Center members and everyone who's here as part of this community. So maybe we can just say a little bit more about how the platform works. I don't want to talk too much so that you guys don't get a chance to talk. But the core idea, and Alex has been flipping through the platform, is that it's simple to click. It's simple to upload a little bit of your own personal information. You can answer these initial prompts about what is your dream job and what's standing in your way. And then we run a moderation filter, which are people, editors, looking at these stories, choosing ones to be posted on the site, and then indeed they can be mapped to a global map that sort of represents what these 10,000 stories really look like. So, this is the beta, this is the starting point, and we're going to be building this thing in earnest with major publishing partners over the months and years to come. You heard about some of the publishing partners that we're working on, The Atlantic, The Huffington Post, PBS NewsHour, PRI's The World, ABC News. All these are publishers who have said to us, yes, we like this idea. We want to take some of these best stories and we want to work with you to develop them, and we want to put them out there into the world. So we know that this is viable. We know that there's a lot to figure out around exactly how does the process work, how do we perfect it, how do we get as many stories as we want, all these other things that go into a little startup like we're building. But in the end, we know we're going to be able to sort of elevate youth voices while also getting a deeper understanding of the very people who are hurting out there, who are finding challenges getting jobs. And to get into those sort of nuances, I think will be interesting for center members also to run reports on the data, to start asking targeted survey questions around particular things, particular programs that you're working on. There's a lot that can be done with this, I think, as long as we continue to sort of proceed in a smart way. So what do you guys have to say?
So the teacher in me always ends at the, it comes to the end of something like this, and I ask myself, so what did I learn today? And so in thinking about that, in terms of sort of the 10,000 youth, which seems like a lot, by the way, let me tell you how we got to this point. We have, through the Global Center for Youth Employment, 40 organizations, and the global footprint is over 100 countries. And collectively, these organizations serve 1 million youth annually. That's a lot of youth. So our thinking is, through the collective impact, as Aaron pointed out at the beginning, is how do we leverage the resources to reach out? And if you're looking at touching serving 1 million kids a year, youth, 10,000 seems like a reasonable goal. Now, if I didn't give you that explanation and I gave you the 10,000 as Kevin did, you probably went, oh my God, that's a lot of young people and a lot of stories. So a couple of things that I learned today. One was from Wesley, who said, don't pay attention to just the story that's in front of you at the moment. And I think when we think about youth and the issues facing them and around self-sufficiency and livelihoods, etc., we need to figure out a way that these stories are not just a snapshot, but really kind of a motion picture. I've been thinking about it a little bit in terms of mosaic and having stories be individual tiles, and how do you pull those together. So that's sort of one lesson that's sort of lingering. The other is, given the presentation of Hillary and others this morning, thinking about new media strategies. I'm the old guy in the panel. I guess they wanted to give a balance, and so as I've been working with GroundTruth and all the gang, I mean, I'm just learning. It's an upward curve here, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, how do we leverage their thinking to not just use the global center to reach out to youth, but then to push these stories out so you really do have an impact, because we've got lots of research reports. I got an office full of them. We need something different, and I think that's the other beauty in terms of lesson learned in terms of thinking about this morning. We've got organizations here that serve tremendous number of youth. We have media, and we have sort of research capabilities, and then the fourth leg of the stool is really the users. I mean, that's a completely different perspective in the story. So I think that's sort of the power of this in concept. And now we're certainly ready for all the negatives and things that we haven't thought about. And we're building it as we fly. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just add one thing, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for your questions about the site. I want to riff off of something that Noku said, and how wonderful is Noku? I mean, she's just this amazingly resilient young woman who, when I first interviewed her for this, said, my goal is to realize Nelson Mandela's dream for my country. And I just thought, wow, that's something to get up for every day. But I think she exemplified something for me that is important about this site, but is also challenging for the site. So in my work with youth and on youth development, there's such a trope of blaming youth. Well, really, it can't be that hard, can it? I mean, you're a Nini. You're not in school. You're not trying to get trained. You haven't found a job. It must be on you, right? There must be something wrong with you. And I think when you hear from Noku that what she didn't say was when she graduated university, she returned to her unelectrified rural village about an hour from Durban, South Africa, where both of her parents were sick and any resources in their house needed to be used for the medication of her parents. And on a weekly basis, she found a way to commute into Durban, get into an internet cafe, work on her resume, get it printed out, and get it sent out. She did that for 2 years. And was very frustrating. It's stories like that that I think the world needs to hear when they're trying to figure out what's going on with 50% youth unemployment rates. But the other problem with that story is, how do we get Noku and her voice up onto this site in that village? Now she lives in Durban and works for Harambe, but there's another Noku out there that doesn't have an Instagram account and doesn't have access to an iPhone to upload their video. So we're thinking really hard about that. And options we're looking into are, ability to SMS stories into the site, ability to call a phone line where your voice recording will then be converted into content and put on the site, the ability to mail content in, photos, poetry, handwriting, which we would then scan and put on the site. So it's not going to be easy, but this site is not going to succeed if it's youth from Spain and from Istanbul and from Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo and Calgary. It's got to be a diverse, and not that we need to engineer it for the last mile either, but I'm excited. I think 10,000 is going to be is a really ambitious number. We're going to definitely need all of our center members, and that's what we're doing this afternoon, is meeting with our center members to try to brainstorm how we can really leverage this site. But that's where I'd leave it. Do you want to add one thing, and then let's take some questions on the site?
Sure. Yeah, I would just say, this is a work in progress, and we know that access is an issue, right? That's so important to us, but we are willing to make that extra work, to do that extra work and go that extra mile to make sure that this is as accessible as possible over time.
Exactly. Cool. So we've actually got 15 minutes. Take some questions. I see Tom's got his hand up. Introduce yourself, and particularly for the center members that are here, tell us where you're from. We're getting microphones.
I don't need a microphone. My name in high school was microphone. Okay, hi. I'm Tom Herlihy. I'm with Land O'Lakes. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am so excited about this. I just wanted to raise what I think is going to be an issue, and I think you're sort of getting at it, Eric, right now. I'm worried about this being urban-centric. For those of you who know anything about Land O'Lakes, we do a lot of agricultural development. We tend to work in rural areas. I've devoted 31 years of my life to trying to solve the problem of global hunger. 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. And most of the people in rural areas are trying to work on this problem. They're the ones mostly going to bed hungry every night. They're the ones who are undereducated. They're not connected. Maybe their village is at the end of that last mile. So I want to put a challenge out there for all of us, because we are a member of the Global Center. How are we going to reach these people? How are we going to let them have their voices be heard? Thank you.
Yeah. I don't think we have to perfectly answer that today. It's a concern we have. I know it's a concern you have, Tom. I think I would say two things. Sometimes I'm amazed at the connectivity some people do have, and the access is sometimes, I think we have this image in our head of people without any access to technology. Certainly getting word out to those young people and having their ability to find the one phone in the house or the one access point and get a story in, I think is high expectations, but I think it's something we should set ourselves to. 3 months from now, when you guys come back and check out this site, if there's not a story from Liberia or there's not a story from rural Kenya, we've failed, and so we're going to keep on that, I think.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, go ahead, Branka.
Okay. So Branka Minic, Future Work Consulting. Ambitious 10,000, congratulations on the launch. By when?
So the plan is by April 30th. So we're setting a tall task, and we're not afraid of a big ambition here. So we know that as many stories as we're able to get, those will be stories that we can use, that we'll be able to work with. We'll be able to connect with those people who have submitted those stories. And so if it ends up being 5,000 stories that we get, we will work with those. We will launch a new campaign to bring in more stories, and we'll keep going. That's one of those things. We're not going to be deterred by a number and whether we hit it or not, but we think it's good to have a target.
And you mentioned that the stories will be moderated. How do we ensure that nothing is lost in translation, both the language translation and interpretation?
Yes, so that is so important, and it's clear to see this starts in English, and then for us, this goes into many languages. I mean, RTI site I was looking at just the other day, I see that you can translate into a number of languages when you visit the homepage. I assume that wasn't necessarily the case when you first launched the site in the early days of the internet, but you've iterated, and I know a lot of other very popular services have done the same thing, right? You start in sort of the country where you are, and then you go from there. So we plan to do the same. And I would just add one thing, which is one of our partners, the Huffington Post, which, as everyone here I'm sure knows, it has verticals all over the world in many languages. It also started in English, and then it has built into many languages over time. The Huffington Post has already raised its hand and said, hey, we'll help with translation. You send us a story in English, we'll put one of our people on the ground who is bilingual or multilingual. We'll translate the story for you, and we'll publish it through our verticals. So we're excited about that possibility, too. I hear you, absolutely. We don't want anything lost in translation. This should be true to the story itself and to the person who's telling the story.
And let me go back to Tom's comment as well. So we don't have this completely envisioned, but so this afternoon, I mean, what I imagine happening is we're going to brainstorm a bit, but you've got people running programs in those rural areas, right? What we need to know from your people is what do they need to be able to reach those young people that they're working with? You know, if one of the solutions is we need, voice translation or something, then we'll figure it out and we'll get it in their hands. So I think that's going to be the interesting part. Is this was a collective idea, by the way. I mean, the history of this is it came from the Idea-a-thon. It was voted the #1 issue or idea, not issue. And so I think everyone saw the real value of this, and so now the challenge is how do we mobilize to really reach a stretch goal. But it is achievable, and we'll divide and conquer, I guess is one way of putting it.
Go ahead, Luis.
Luis Crouch from RTI. One interesting piece of advice that I got when I was starting some particular phase in my life that succeeded way beyond what I thought. Someone said, worry about success as much as the possibility of failure, because if you succeed, you're going to have some really interesting problems. I mean, let's say that you get the 10,000 or even more. And maybe this is so obvious it doesn't need to be said, but I think it would be wonderful not to have just the 35 stories, but to team up with either internal partners within RTI or some of the high-tech partners to do a lot of natural language processing of the, whatever it is, 9,965 stories that don't make it to the 35. Because in those stories, there'll be a lot of statistical power to this unintentional, sort of somewhat unintentional text. It's not like doing a survey of employment trends, but there'll be a lot of really juicy stuff in there that a machine could pick out, but that human beings won't have the time to go through the 10,000 stories.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't tee that up, but that's probably a point that we have not articulated enough today. The intersection of Ground Truth with RTI and indeed with the other center members is intentionally, on the one hand, media and editorial partners and running the 35 stories per year or whatever it is that really get picked up and end up on an Atlantic Monthly or whatever it might be. But it's also to create a qualitative database, a searchable content base, maybe one part TripAdvisor, one part, ResearchGate, and such that policymakers, researchers might have access to content in a way. And we're going to have to add functionality that will allow that searchability and that qualitative research to be done more easily. But that's the point, Luis. And by the way, the 9,965 stories that don't get selected for professional production remain on the site. It's not, you get chosen or you don't get chosen, then you're off. And I think we didn't fully get Branka's answer, and Branka asked about moderation. I think it's probably like Hillary mentioned. I mean, part of what we're trying to avoid is just a dump where trolls and people are commenting and there's I don't know, maybe ISIS is uploading videos. Who knows what the case might be? But there's a human element. There's a human element to what we're doing, such that not so that we choose this story is valid and worth putting up and this story isn't, or let's clip this one at minute 3 and not let the last 30 seconds go, but that it's a site with some moderation. And so I think that's not an intent to lose some things, but rather just to have a responsible site.
That's right. So that's built in. Oh, we've got a question over here.
Yeah, is there a hashtag dream candidate or dream solution to go with hashtag dream job? When I look at the card, it starts with the stories of the job seeker, but then you list activists and entrepreneurs, companies, NGOs. Peter, you started us on this. Are you going to try to get narrative stories about what an employer who's looking for talent like we saw on the Google Hangouts or solutions that haven't been created yet that they can create? Are we going to talk to their story too?
Yes, we're headed there. So we think it starts with the dream, and then it goes into, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's get into the solutions. Let's run natural language processing analysis on the submissions and tease out interesting nuances that we wouldn't have been able to see by looking at the stories themselves. Absolutely. And that's why we're sort of reaching out our hands now and sort of asking for help and asking for partners who have strengths that say we as a journalism organization don't have, that say RTI as a research institution doesn't have, although I don't know what those would be. And so on, right? Everybody is bringing something to this coalition, to this collective, and so I hope that we're going to be able to do this together and make this really strong around solutions, certainly.
Did that answer your question, Alejandro, or were you asking about the employer voices?
Well, both. It's like if we got the demand for jobs, what about the stories of those who are supplying jobs? Or if we got the supply of candidates, the stories of those employers are telling us over and over, statistics say, that they want to employ people, but they're having trouble translating it into the right set of skills, requirement, and mindset that they need. Is there another side to it for employers as well as those who need solutions in their communities?
Sounds like a good call. I mean, we could definitely do a call around employer voices and these strands. Yeah, I mean, by all means. Somebody asked us, what's the age range or age limit on submitting to the site? I don't think we have real rigid guidelines on who could submit. And, you know, do you have to be a youth, or you're an employer? No, you can't submit, or whatever. So I think we could do calls. We could create buckets. Because you're right, Alejandro. This stat that everybody puts up about the skills gap, that, you know, that 85% of CEOs said they'd hire 100 people tomorrow if they could find them, and 50% of South Africans are unemployed. What's going on here? To get that voice on the site, I think, is equally important. So I think we hear you. We have Aaron here, and we're at the 5-minute warning. I hear some grumbling stomachs, so we're gonna go with Aaron.
An idea that you might want to explore. I think it's always important to identify role models, advocates, champions, and so you're going to identify 35 champions around the world. I think we ought to give serious consideration to putting a spotlight on these individuals in their countries so that they can be perceived as role models and inspire the rest of youth in those countries. And one of the things that I find fascinating about the CNN Heroes Awards every year is that they put a spotlight on countries that normally most people around the world have very little knowledge about. And we could use this platform to really highlight, showcase these 35 champions, role models, advocates in a way that could be very productive and constructive within their own countries.
I think it's a great point.
Love it.
We got Sharka, why don't you go ahead?
I know we will be brainstorming about it in the afternoon, but I really want us to think about the young people who will apply for this, because what we are seeing is it's creating an expectations. You know, they will be putting their story out there, and they will expect something happening and change about that topic. So if we go to the same communities next year, and these first champions say, well, I submitted my story, didn't get selected, and that was the end of it, it's just not going to get the same traction. So this is something we should be really thinking through in the afternoon and follow up, because you want to have a 35 top champions, but it's little for compared what the network effect you want to create. And let's just think this through, because just participating and providing input is not enough. So
that's such a great point. And we do hope that, there becomes value in being part of the community, not just if you're chosen on this particular campaign, but that it was worth your time, and that it means something to be part of this Youth Voices initiative.
And we've been thinking about incentives for organizations to reach out to youth. So, and it doesn't have to be financial incentives. There's a lot of incentives to think about. I love the idea, can we bring in some celebrities to sort of answer the question in some ways, or how they would have answered it when they were youth. And then it really, you can build up some excitement. I mean, maybe that's a solution. So a lot of we're going to need some very creative ideas to get to this 10,000 by April 30th.
Just one more thing, Peter, on that one. 30-second story. Some of you may know President Obama's Young African Leadership Initiative, YALI program. They put YALI out, the call for applications. They were going to fund 500 young African leaders to come to the United States for the summer. I think IREX is in the room. IREX manages this program. Yeah. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, but I think there was 50,000 applicants in the first year for those 500 spots. 35 the next. Right, so I was with the U.S. government at the time, and there was this moment where it said, well, we have 50,000 young Africans found their way somewhere to an internet cafe or whatever access technology, submitted this 5-page application, whatever. It took a thoughtful attempt at doing this. Now what do we do with 49,000 disappointed young Africans? And so what did they do? They created a network site for people that had applied to YALI but hadn't won. And now they run MOOCs through that site. They run job opportunities and scholarship opportunities, meetups. Young people are finding each other and they're finding opportunity through the YALI network, even if they weren't selected to go to Berkeley for the summer and be one of the chosen young leaders. So I think we can look into network functionalities for people that log in, sign up, and submit and aren't selected to be on the front page of a newspaper, but yet can find each other locally or find a resource or find Plan International locally or whatever the case might be. I think in the stories we heard earlier, there was a lot of people saying, I just needed someone to believe in me. So well, maybe this is a way for those people to find someone to believe in them or to find a local resource that they hadn't known existed. So I'm hopeful that it will be more than just submit and hope that you get selected. And so I think it's a great point, Sharka. Let's do one more. Yes, sir?
Do you have a place for those lost youth from Flint, Michigan and Ferguson? And
Yes. I mean, that's a great question. And we built this to be an international, a truly global initiative. And, it's one of those things where, I mean, hearing Wesley speak and hearing the journalists this morning, talking about trying to find those stories at moments of crisis and tumult. I mean, one of the things that Ground Truth often does, we tell stories of war zones, of the worst, right? But Flint is the kind of story that's it's right on the border between, it must feel like a war zone to be, having poisoned water, having the police shooting at you. And yet there's something very mundane about some of these problems too. The youth unemployment, I mean, sometimes it's just boredom, it's malaise. It's the young Spaniard that I think Juan Herrero alluded to, who was playing online poker all day because that's all he really had to do with himself. So, it's not glamorous, it's not war zone, it's important, and we feel like there's a way here to identify those kinds of stories and tell them in a way that casts them in a light that perhaps, illuminates or gives insight into a problem that can at times seem sort of dull and eluding storytelling.
Yeah, I think, and our members are global. So we have members that work in the United States, Plan International, World Vision, IRC, RTI, others that hopefully will, the site will not just be about Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, but equally about Flint, Michigan or Washington, D.C. So I'm a stickler for time. I know we've taken a lot of yours. And for those of you that are online, I think we had over 100 people log into the YouTube feed. Thank you. Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks to Steve Grove and the young people that came in from around the world. Thanks to what I thought was an amazing panel that Charlie led this morning. Thanks to Aaron and to RTI for hosting this. Thank you. And you're free to leave.